Welcome! Today we are looking at the current week of Mythic Plus, how the affixes have changed the dungeons, the easiest ones and the hardest ones. The affixes being Fortified, Sanguine, Quaking, and the seasonal affix, Prideful. We're looking at the representation of the specs, how it has progressed from last week, from the week before that, and compared to the overall current season. And then we look at raids. We look at the current performance of all specs, this last week compared to the previous weeks, if some specs have improved or if some specs have worsened, and some have, definitely. So there are some interesting picks to look at, and we're starting with Mythic Plus. When we are looking at Mythic Plus, when you look at the plus 10 to plus 14 range, it's the biggest range. It's the range that is going to comprise most of the players that are running high keys. So it has the most amount of logs, the most amount of players, but it also is the one that is harder to change. Because there are so many logs, it would take quite a drastic change to be able to shift these numbers. And in fact, this week, nothing really major is happening here. What is interesting though, is when you look at the more competitive side of things, which is the Mythic plus 15 and higher. I am saying it's interesting, although probably for just about everyone except Resto Shamans is not going to be. Because this is another week where Resto Shaman is gaining ground over everyone else. They went from 32% representation at 15 and higher keys to 34.2. So they are increasing their representation even more. The other specs for healers have not really changed. Mistweaver Monk is still very low, together with Holy Priest. Discipline Priest is still okay, quite represented, and then Holy Paladin is still being the third more popular spec, trying to catch up with Resto Druid. When we look at melee DPS is where there is another interesting change. For the high keys, Windwalker Monk, we talked about this. Windwalker Monk started in week number 2 of Mythic Plus at 7.7%. Week 3, 10.5%. Week 4, they were last week at 12.8%. And now, this week, they are currently at 15%. So in a matter of 3 weeks, they have effectively doubled their representation in high keys. They have now easily passed all the other specs that they were contending with. Havoc, Arms, Red Paladin, they have all passed them quite easily now, and they are trying to catch up at this point with Unholy. Rogue seems a little bit too far away at the moment. So the good period, the good state of Windwalker continues. When we're looking at range DPS, on the other hand, there is not really any changes. All the specs have remained as popular as they were before, with the exception of Marksmanship Hunter becoming even more represented, breaking the 30% barrier, which is quite high for a role with 11 different specs. 11 different specs, and one of them takes up 30% of all the picks. Lastly, for the Mythic Plus representation, there is one thing to mention, because nothing has changed this week, and it's important, because this is now the third week, okay? The third week in a row where Protection Paladin is quite more represented than Brewmaster Monk in the 10 to 14 range, but also, at the same time, it's the third week where Brewmaster Monk is keeping up the advantage and the rise over Prot Paladin in 15 and higher keys. So we can now say effectively and decisively that Brewmaster Monk is the second more represented spec in high keys as a tank compared to Protection Paladin. Quite a big drop of protection, it's pretty obvious. It seems like that Protection Paladin is too squishy. The health bar of a Protection Paladin is basically jumping up and down like a Vengeance Demon Hunter, with the exception that they lack the healing of a Vengeance Demon Hunter, so it makes them rather volatile to be healed in Mythic Plus. Whereas, of course, Brewmaster Monk is way more smooth. The reason why I think Brewmaster Monk has gotten to this point isn't just because of the defensiveness, also because of their damage. Blizzard in the beta, coming before live, right before Shadowlands, has kept buffing the damage of Brewmaster Monk. They have kept buffing the legendary for Brewmaster damage. They nerfed it at first by 50%, and then they reverted it just a few days before the expansion, and now Brewmaster Monk is doing very well. I'm happy this is turning to be, like I said, that Brewmaster Monk would have gained popularity the higher the keys started getting. However, I also said Guardian Druid would have, and they haven't. They have still chilling at around 10% representation, which I still think it's okay. I still think it's somewhat healthy. It's not completely dead. Like, of course, Protection Warrior, who is still sitting at about 3.5% representation. That is what I would consider unhealthy representation for a spec. So this is the current situation for Mythic Plus. In this current week, we are seeing Restoration Shaman keeping their climb over the healers. We are seeing that Havoc Demon Hunter is keeping the stronghold on the tanks, but Brewmaster Monk is also becoming more and more popular as time goes by. Similar discussion for monks. Monks on the rise in the melee DPS slot because Windwalker Monk keeps rising, whereas range DPS is still on a lock. It's marksmanship, fire, and balance, and then the rest. When, on the other hand, we look at raids. So, this is how we left a week and a half ago. A week and a half ago is an important breakpoint because that was the last week of the release, essentially, of all the legendaries. It was the last world boss available, so all the possible legendaries had become available for everyone, for every spec. So we had to wait about 10 days to give time to all these new specs that have gotten the new legendaries to start performing, and now we can see how they have been doing. The first thing that is going to catch your eye, of course, is going to be Elemental Shaman, which has gone from slightly above middle of the pack to top 4, and they have kept rising up to this point. This is of course due and thanks to their legendary they have gotten, of course, from the world boss, Windspeaker's Lava Resurgence. The other thing that you should be able to notice from this is that every single melee DPS spec is lower. Even when you look at Windwalker and Unholy, which are at the top, they are now dropped. When you look at all the other specs, from Retribution Paladin, which got lower, even Arms and Fury, which already were low, they are still even lower. You have Subtlety, which also had a big drop down, Feral as well as Enhancement. So basically all of them. Now, this doesn't mean that there's been a stealth nerf somewhere. It doesn't mean that they are performing all worse. All melee players have suddenly gotten worse. You have to remember that these logs come from bosses. So the more we go week after week, the more bosses will be killed, the more logs will there be, which means these performances are going to be tied by the type of boss. So if you have a boss that is very unfriendly to melee DPS, what's going to happen is they're going to have worse performances. So the more logs will come in for that boss, the worse the melee DPS performance will seem because that boss is so bad for melee. For example, take Hungering Destroyer. Hungering Destroyer is very pivotal for these type of logs because it's an early boss, it's getting killed by more and more guilds, so going by 10 more days, it's more logs. And this is how Hungering Destroyer looks. This is the bottom of Hungering Destroyer. As you can see, it's just basically melee DPS specs and the few range DPS specs that have been abandoned, like Frost Mage and Arcane Mage because everyone is playing Fire, or Destruction Warlock because everyone is Affliction. If you take out those specs, it's just melee. So obviously, the deeper we go into the raid with logs and numbers, the more unfriendly melee fights are gonna be, the worse the overall performance of melee specs is going to look like. So there is no conspiracy by Blizzard to stealth nerf all the melee. The reason why all the melee are lower this week, there are more logs in more melee unfriendly bosses, so their overall damage has gone down. The other thing that can jump into your attention is, for example, that Balanced Druid is now back to the top from where it were before. Before it was even passed by Feral, for example. This is the same argument for melee. If there is a fight that is particularly good for certain specs, of course they will have a much higher performance shown week by week. Take this, for example. This is Council of Blood. Yes, so in about 10 days there have been almost 3 times as many guilds killing Council of Blood. On top of that, all the guilds that killed Council of Blood before have now re-cleared Council of Blood. And if this is the damage that happens in Council of Blood, you can see why Balanced Druid is back at the top. If you haven't done Council of Blood, there are going to be tons of little ads, almost completely irrelevant, that nobody cares about, or bothers to even kill. So, guess who's gonna take all that damage? Starfall. And that's why Balanced Druid is where it is. I don't think it is as good as this week's logs are showing, because they are being essentially inflated by the extremely overperforming of the spec on Council of Blood. Another tiny thing to mention is that when we look, instead of looking at the overall logs, so literally every single log that has been shown, meaning players who die, players who are sent to the cuck shed to do some mechanics, meaning they will lose a lot of DPS. If we take all of that out and we look at the 90 percentile, so only the top 10% of all logs for all specs, it doesn't change much. The rankings are basically the same, which normally speaking is not very good. This means that the very simple to play specs have no downside. It means that There is no spec that can be played to its best. There is no spec with a very high skill ceiling, meaning you can outperform others purely because you can play the spec better. When you see top 90 percentile logs having the same rankings as a 20 percentile log, you know, it means more or less all the specs can be performed at a similar level. There are some minor differences. For example, Windwalker Monk becomes higher than Affliction. You know, Affliction is a 4-button snooze fest. Windwalker is way more dynamic, way more versatile, and more complicated to play than Affliction. So, of course, it shows that the top 10% of Windwalker players can pull out a higher performance out of their specs compared to the Windwalkers that misplay. Whereas Affliction Warlocks don't have many windows to misplay because it's very simple. So when you look at their overall log or their 90 percentile log, not much changes. But for a spec like Windwalker, they can actually improve. Another thing worth mentioning regarding raids is healers, since we haven't talked about healers yet. In this past week, actually 10 days, closer to a couple of weeks, we have gotten the continued rise of Holy Paladin, as well as the, I guess, returning to their usual spot of Discipline Priest. Holy Priest has now dropped lower, because of course, when literally every Discipline Priest is rerolling to Holy to play the Kel'Thas fight, and the logs have not many kills after Kel'Thas, because we are early in progression, the deeper we go into the progression, the more logs after Kel'Thas will come in, where all the Discipline Priests are respecking back to Discipline, so Discipline is gaining more and more ground over Holy. The other point to make is that Restoration Druid keeps dropping. This is because more and more people playing Druid are respecking, because they aren't used, you know, in their life. They aren't emotionally prepared to not being Flavor of the Month. They can't handle it for more than a tier, so they are all respecking to Holy Paladin or Resto Shaman. That's what's happening right now. They went from being 4 times the logs of a Mistweaver Monk to just 2 times the logs of Mistweaver Monks, and it's not that the Mistweaver Monks are growing, so yeah, there is an exodus of Resto Druids right now. Whereas for tanks, actually nothing has changed. Brewmaster and Vengeance are still easily the more popular. They both have over twice as many logs as any other tank. And Blood Decay and Protection Paladin are in the middle, with Guardian and Protection Warrior at the bottom. So to close this spec portion of the video, tanks are basically unchanged. Healers are getting more and more Holy Paladins and Resto Shamans compared to the fleeing Resto Druids, and no real changes for Mistweaver Monks, whereas Discipline Priests are regaining their dominance over Holy Priests that they have had for years. Whereas for DPS, there has been the rise of Elemental Shaman, which is continuing thanks to their legendary they have gotten for less than 2 weeks now, as well as the drop of pretty much all of the melee specs due to the more melee unfavored fights that are in the raid. And as more guilds are going to kill them and re-kill them, logs are going to come in, and the average of the melee DPSers is going to become lower. It's going to be lower and lower than the range DPS, since they have an advantage. Now, as for the last part, where we talk about the actual dungeons, 2 things are very important in a Quaking and Sanguine week, despite the fact that it's a very easy week. Space and density. Space is very important because the more narrow, the more tight and small the space you have to fight is in, the more problematic Quaking and Sanguine at the same time are going to be, because there's going to be less room to drop the Sanguine pools, and there's going to be less room to spread for your Quaking. At the same time, the mob density can also be a problem, because the more mobs there are, the more Sanguine pools are going to happen. And of course, when both of those problems combine, like you have a narrow corridor, and in the narrow corridor you have 6 mobs, it becomes very difficult. Which is why, to the surprise of absolutely nobody, the hardest dungeon by about 73 miles, I have calculated, is Sanguine Depths. Sanguine Depths is easily the worst one because, of course, it is almost entirely a corridor. Meaning every time trying to drop Sanguine pools is going to be a pain, spreading for Quaking is going to be a pain. What makes Sanguine Depths even more annoying, if it wasn't enough, if all of these things weren't enough, what makes it annoying is that they have several mobs, several casters that don't move. Casters that you can interrupt, but if you interrupt them, they're going to spam an ability that can't be interrupted anyways, so they're not going to move. Or casters that straight up are casting uninterruptible spells, so they're not moving anyways. So it makes it quite annoying to be able to maneuver around the place with these type of casters. And on top of that, the room you have for abusing line of sight, so to force them to move, is actually also pretty limited. So it just makes it a very annoying dungeon this week. By far the more annoying. Spending literally 30 seconds on the easiest ones, because every week is the same thing. The easiest ones are Mists and Halls of Atonement. As I mentioned already, they are just undertuned dungeons. They are really nothing that can threaten you this week. Mists and Halls of Atonement are also pretty wide and spacious, so the problems of Sanguine isn't really there. You do have Halls of Atonement, a couple of pulls at the end, where Sanguine is kind of annoying, but really nobody cares. Same goes for Quaking, about the same thing. Halls of Atonement's entire problem during Fortified can be the Shards of Alkia's Thrash, except that Thrash can be out of ranged, so you can just run away during Thrash. It doesn't matter if it's a Fortified 4 or it's a Fortified 35, you're still taking 0 damage anyways, so very easy dungeons this week as well. When it comes to the middle of the pack, where you have Necrotic, Other Side, Plaguefall, Theater of Pain, and Spires, the easier one is going to be Plaguefall. As you know, Plaguefall has gotten its Thrash nerfed by quite a bit a couple of weeks ago. So Fortified weeks are basically the thing you want to aim for Plaguefall, not Tyrannical. The good thing for Plaguefall for these type of affixes is that it's very open, it's very wide, so Quaking is never a problem in Plaguefall, pretty much. It does have some annoying trash, like the Blighted Spinebreaker, which you should most likely avoid on Fortified. But for the most part, the combination of the toughness of Plaguefall being tyrannical, which isn't a problem now, and the lenient timer that you have in Plaguefall makes it rather easy. The other easy dungeon for similar reasons is going to be Theater of Pain. Theater of Pain is actually narrow at times. However, Theater of Pain has a massive amount of bosses. On top of that, they also have mini-bosses, you know, the duelists that you have to face, which you only fight once at a time. So on Fortified, you have a lot of single target encounters as well as bosses, which are not affected by Fortified. So this leaves you with a lot of time to finish your trash count. The only real dangerous packs, which are actually similar to other weeks, this week is not making it overly problematic, but are the big pool of Shackled Souls when you enter the Kultarok area. You know, that is a rather narrow zone, so dropping Sanguines with all of those guys casting, trying to interrupt them all, becomes kind of a problem. And the other one is, of course, the pool in the Chamber of Conquest, the one in the corridors between mini-bosses, where you have to take down the Ancient Captain, buffing his entire pack. It's a problem because the Shambling Arbalists are spam casting uninterruptible ranged attacks, so any Sanguine, it's a problem, because they're not gonna move. That is pretty much the more dangerous part of the entirety of the Theater of Pain dungeon, so if you get past that, it is rather easy. And then, for the bottom three, you have the Other Side, which is still the easier of the three. The Other Side, similar to Plaguefall, is a worse key on Tyrannical. Talking about space and density, it's not too big of an issue, particularly the space, even though you have to go into 3 different zones with 3 different layouts. Spacing for Sanguine and Quaking is not that difficult, only in the wing of a car is somewhat problematic, but the trash itself is manageable. Trash on the Other Side has never been the problem, except for the big undead pulls you're making outside of the specific zones. As long as it's not tyrannical, the Other Side is going to remain a chill key. And then, of course, you have Necrotic Wake. Necrotic Wake remains, you know, with the issue of tank damage on fortified keys because of Tenderize and Mutilate in the Necropolis. Below the Necropolis, there is nothing too big that's going to be an issue because, of course, it's also very spacious, which means your Quaking and your Sanguine are not too big of an issue. I guarantee you a bunch of people are going to wipe in the Necropolis because they are trying to spread the Sanguine and move the mobs, and they forget they are actually pulling the entire room as they do this. That is probably going to happen quite a few times to quite a few groups. But that's the same problem that Necrotic Quake has always had, and these two affixes are not making it any harder. There are quite a few other affixes that can make the Necrotic Wake fortified weeks harder, so this is still one of the better weeks for Necrotic Wake. And then the last one, right above Sanguine Depths, is going to be Spires of Ascension, because Spires of Ascension trash is still pretty annoying. It has been nerfed, like Plaguefall, yes. However, Plaguefall's problem was tyrannical. Spires of Ascension problem was the trash, not tyrannical. So even with the nerfs, the trash in Spires of Ascension is pretty annoying. You should engineer yourself. This is one of the keys where you do want to get a little bit of a more refined route, because you want to skip as many of the big packs as you can. And it's also one of the dungeons where these big packs are so annoying that it is recommended to bloodlust on trash packs. Of course, many coordinated higher key groups are going to bloodlust on fortified on many trash packs anyways, but even if you're in packs, you want to keep an eye on bloodlusting terrible trash pools like the one before the first boss or even the second boss. But still, Spires of Ascension is still in the same situation of the other keys, where these two affixes are not really making it any worse than other affixes you could have had in combination. The only one, which is why it's at the bottom, is Sanguine Depths, because space and pool density, mob density, is so bad in Sanguine Depths that Sanguine and Quaking make it actually worse than other affixes. So with the Spires of Ascension, we are done with our weekly roundup of the dungeons with the current affixes, and this brings to a close the video where we went over the specs in Raid and Mythic Plus as well as the dungeons. Let me guys know what you think about the current state of specs in Raids and Mythic Plus. You don't need to tell me how much you hate Sanguine Depths this week. I know. Thank you. So, see you guys soon. And in the meantime, I believed in Mistweaver. I actually did.